So now we move on to this next session on Togail ar Guthan. So this is a forum on Corsneachcan a Cúpa le Nuch Ransiki, communities working with researchers, and I'm very delighted and honoured to be able to present this with Lewis. So as we said at the beginning, this is an innovative project, and one of the important innovations is that people in the community and those involved in the survey are co-researchers with the academics. So what we wanted to look at was what research methodologies are suitable for this, what benefits arise from it, from academics, universities working mutually with communities, and how can this be developed? What role will the grassroots community play? What has been learned from this? So we've got a very distinguished collection of people to discuss this with. But first of all, I wanted to introduce Lewis, who's been mentioned, who's been mentioned before, he comes from a neuroscience research and community engagement background and is a founder of the social enterprise Science CIALL, an award-winning Scottish organisation supporting creativity, curiosity and well-being. And he's also a head of the Ideas Fund in the Scottish Highlands and Islands. There's a whole lot more I could say, but that would take up the whole of the session. But anyway, welcome, Lewis, and thank you again for your support for this Comann Uist Tuath project. So I'll leave it to Lewis to talk a little bit about the Ideas Fund perspective and the framing of the session, and also to introduce our panel today. Over to you, Lewis.
It's really good to be here. I'm very excited. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm very privileged to have been working with CUT, Uist Historical Society, Uist and with some of the researchers who've been involved. Just to set a wee bit of context, so I've been working with the Ideas Fund, which is led by the British Science Association and Science CIALL. We help support, particularly across the Highlands and Islands, as John has mentioned. And I guess the context of this is traditionally research happens in a way where researchers and institutions lead and get the funding and very often work with communities, and that can be obviously incredibly enriching, but unfortunately sometimes this work can feel very top down, it can feel quite extractive, and the power dynamics are not necessarily as co-productive as we'd like to see them. And so the rationale between the Ideas Fund was thinking, well, how could we develop a process, a research process, which could fund communities themselves directly to be able to lead research and the partnership. So the funding goes to the communities, they set the agenda on what areas around well-being they would like to explore, and then through that process, either they find their own partnerships with researchers or we help support them as Science CIALL to match them with researchers and develop a program from there. And this partnership working is not easy, and to think about that kind of wraparound support and that learning and building that cohort across the Highlands and Islands as well. And so we're really excited to be here to share some of that learning today. We have some of the researchers involved and some new voices as well, friends and allies of the programme to share their perspectives too. And so in terms of the speakers, we have some of the researchers who have been involved through the process. We have Gordon Well from University of Highlands and Islands. We have Heather Morgan and Jessica Wood from the University of Aberdeen joining us as well. We have from CUT, Màiri is going to join us as well. She couldn't quite get away from not speaking, and she has been very much the coordinator and mastermind alongside the rest of the CUT team, of course. And then we also have Professor Stewart Angus from Nature.Scot to join and share some reflections, as well as Ruthanne Baxter from Prescribed Culture in Edinburgh. So I think we're going to kick off. Let's start with yourself, Gordon, if that's all right, to share a little bit about your learning from the Language Science Institute at UHI.
Thanks, Thanks very much. James, I think you've got my list of links that we talked about. I wonder if you could put it in the chat, please. There's 8 or 9 of them. I don't want to talk in detail about them all, but I would like to highlight 2 or 3 of them. So I've just tried pasting them, and for some reason I'm not able to do that. So if you could put them in, if you can find them and put them in, that would be great. In the meantime, I'll keep on talking. Yes, trying to compress 2 years of work into a 5-minute thing is going to be a challenge. The list, if we get it, is not so much a reading list, more a listening list, I suppose, because, oh, here we go, we're getting them now. And they come in 2 parts, and which will help to explain the Language Sciences Institute background to this, but also the Island Voices background. Because I have a university affiliation, but I'm also a Uist resident with North Uist antecedents, which are close to me and close in meaning. Yeah, there's 2 parts, the UHI affiliation and the community action. On the LSI front, the UHI front, the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th links there, I don't need to show you on screen. They're a mission statement, if you like, and some examples of the work which we've done. The mission statement is a bit wordy, but if I can compress it into a sentence, we're focused, and what's new about, I think, the Language Sciences Institute is that we're focused on use in the community and the valuing of the ordinary and everyday speech of ordinary and everyday people. So that's a clear orientation, if you like, of the LSI Language Sciences Institute interest in Gaelic. As far as examples are concerned, it's clear that we have an islands focus in relation to our Gaelic work, but nevertheless, we do value international linkage too, so that while the focus is Gaelic, it's certainly not to the exclusion of other languages, and particularly with other languages which may be facing similar challenges to Gaelic. So we have partnerships in Jamaica, in India, and a number of other places. The link which I'd like to focus on, James, if you can actually put it on screen, would be the Gaelic Crisis publication link, which is kind of a starting point for the Language Sciences Institute, produced by colleagues in 2020, but now online and freely available for download. And it's a seminal work in many ways, because it's a comprehensive and fine-grained analysis of, as I say, patterns of Gaelic use in the remaining vernacular communities. And the challenging finding which comes out of it is that that use is diminishing, and it's diminishing to the point of near collapse. And that's a message which one would have to say has not been universally welcomed. And indeed, it's not an easy message to hear in many ways. So there, you know, we could have wished for a quicker engagement with the points in it, but nevertheless, there are signs of a shift in policy attention towards the importance of the grounded community use of the language. And when we engaged with the AAS project, the presentation on the Gaelic Crisis document was one of our first workshops. Thanks, James. That's that done. Moving on to the Island Voices side of the operation, The next clips are about, links are about Island Voices, which is what I call a language capture and curation project, which in simple terms simply means recording and sharing those recordings. And the Island Voices or Guthan and Eilean project is a long-standing project. In fact, Hebrides based, predates the CIALL project, predates in fact CIALL, the project was the predecessor to CIALL, and has featured collaboration with Comann, the Uist Tuath, in what I hope has been a mutually beneficial relationship for over a decade now. And we're very pleased to have been able to take part again in AAS with the Comann. The next link, which I think is worth putting up on screen, James, would be actually about the AAS engagement by Island Voices. There's a page there on the Island Voices site. Thank you, great. And in that table there, that's really picking out the Island Voices contributions in phase 1 of the project, where we were, as I said, we featured the Gaelic Crisis publication first of all, but moved on to practical work in terms of getting some community recordings made, but noting also that there's a progress report on the project there and a final review on the Gaelic side of it there as documents, but not written documents. That's the point I wish to make there and underline. These are actual oral documents. And I think that's significant when we're talking about an oral culture, which is what we are predominantly talking about in the case of Gaelic in North Uist. Lastly then, moving on to phase 2. Yep, moving on to phase 2 of the project, and that's the last link I'd like you to share, James, where we've got phase 2 videos that we have again produced more recordings, not just from Island Voices, but from other members of the Wellbeing group, and shared them there. I was pleased to be contributing there, not just as a researcher, but as a community and group member. And again, the fact that we're producing these documents as oral documents is significant because it reinforces our point about the primacy of speech. So thanks very much. I think I should stop there, beyond saying that I'm looking forward to the discussion when we can all talk about what we've learned from this process, which certainly from an Island Voices and UHI perspective has been very enriching.
Thank you, Gordon. If I can just say that Màiri and Aire have greatly appreciated the active engagement of yourself and Guthan and Eilean in the project over the last 2 years, which has greatly enriched it. So thank you. Moving time.
Well, it's been mutual.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Gordon. And really highlighting one of the, I think, key values and learning, I think, of the work of how this distinction between researcher and lived experience is sometimes a spectrum. We obviously really believe that community members can be active researchers. We're going to hear that, but also researchers are members of their community and have that lived experience too. And I think that brings us to bring in Professor Stewart Angus to share maybe a little bit of some of the learning around the coastal changes work that he's been doing. Over to you.
Thank you. I know about a third of the people in this meeting, so allow me to introduce myself to the remainder. I fear I'm a Lewisman, and I would love to be able to tell you or claim that I had some Uist ancestry, but my mother's family seem to have affections only for other Leosochs in as far back as records go. But my own affections seem to have drifted south of the Sound of Harris, so I'm not sure if I can go back to Lewis. If Gordon had difficulty dealing with 2 years of research, I've got 50. I've been coming to Uist since 1976. It's an area I love passionately. and would love to be able to come more often. There has been some discussion about how to work with communities, and the communities themselves would be the best judges of how effectively I do it, but there isn't actually a method. I just go there and interact. And I come from an organisation, sorry, I should explain, I am employed part-time as coastal ecology manager by Nature.Scot, but I'm here in a personal capacity. I'm also an honorary professor at Heriot-Watt University. But again, speaking personally, working for Nature.Scot, which used to be called Scottish Natural Heritage, there is an aim always of getting our message across. And there are times when that is the task you should be conducting, but that isn't how I go into meetings with communities. I talk with communities and pass on the type of information these communities need to learn about in terms I hope are comprehensible. And then I stop talking and I start listening. And I learn a huge amount. And I then use that constructively to advance the research and then report back again. And so the process continues. And as I say, this has been going on for about 50 years. And please don't underestimate the standard of environmental experience in this community. I cover the whole of Scotland for my post with Nature.Scot, and I have never encountered communities with the breadth and depth of knowledge that the Uist have of their environment. And it is highly unlikely that I would be a professor without the input I've had from Uist. So thank you. Thank you enormously. But I'm also here to give you a brief outline of the findings of the research we've been doing in Uist. And I fear it isn't a pleasant message to convey, because these islands are vulnerable, no matter how you look at it. Scotland has an exemplary record, a very proud record of reducing carbon emissions. But Scotland's contribution to global climate change was always going to be minuscule on a comparative basis. However, global climate change's impact on Scotland could be considerable because we are very much a coastal nation. And certain areas of Scotland are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And if I were to ask you to nominate vulnerable areas, you would think of exposed coastlines with a lot of infrastructure on the coast, low-lying coasts, and you would probably come up with a list that included Orkney, Shetland, Uist, and Aire. With the exception of Shetland, that is the same list of the areas of Scotland subject to the highest rates of relative sea level rise. That is in relation to the land, because the land changes level as well. Now, if you look at South Uist and Benbecula, large areas of what is now Màiri used to be at the bottom of lochs. These lochs were drained from about 1750 onwards. And much of what is now croftland or common grazing used to be at the bottom of a loch. These drains were put in at a time when sea level, and low tide in particular, were significantly lower than they are today. That means they are less efficient because they have a more gentle gradient than they had before, but also the proportion of the tidal cycle for which they operate is reducing as sea level rise progresses. if you have a lot of land that is below the level of the sea, because that is what we're talking about here, and in North Uist, we don't have the same digital terrain models we have available for South Uist and Benbecula, so it's impossible to be so precise. But I would imagine the candidate areas for such low-lying status would be between Pable and Balranald, where a drainage programme was carried out.
A minute left, Stuart. Sorry.
Sorry?
Just about a minute left, it's all right.
Okay, I will try and compress it into a minute. In these circumstances, the dune ridge is of critical importance in protecting that low-lying land from the sea. In addition, you have a huge kelp bed west of Uist, stretching for 7 kilometres, which interacts with the wave base to reduce wave energy very significantly. And the theory is that on the night of 10th January 2005, the level of the sea rose to the extent that the wave base disengaged from that kelp bed to some of the highest sea levels, hit Uist with almost all of their energy. With sea level rise, that interaction will reduce. Furthermore, the highest waves and the highest rainfall coincide, so that the most likely time for flooding from the sea or from rainfall is obviously during a storm. Air pressure is critical. Low pressure is associated with the storms. And for every millibar below standard pressure, sea level rises by a centimetre. So at the very time you need the drains most, when you're getting flooding, the drains are at their least efficient because the sea level is at its highest. So all in all, it is a nightmare combination. And what we as scientists have to do here is make our information available to the community to enable that community to plan its future. It is perhaps not our role to influence that process, but sometimes that is the responsible thing to do. But what we mustn't do is attempt to control it. The decision making must remain with the community, because in the whole way of looking at things, the community is always going to have a better all-round picture than any academic. I'll rest my case there.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Yeah, I think that really frames the conversation very strongly, and actually brings us very nicely to our next speakers, thinking about how we can co-develop around well-being with communities as well. So we have Jessica Wood and Dr. Heather Morgan from the University of Aberdeen. Over to yourselves.
Hello. I was just going to ask Heather. Heather, do you want me to start just giving a brief summary? So if for those that had already attended the session this morning, I already sort of probably provided a brief summary of Heather and my role on the Aire Sund project. But for the benefit of those that might not have joined the session, I'll just provide a very brief summary and then maybe chat to Heather about some of those questions I think we'd been given before this panel session about lessons learned and etc. So in brief, Heather and I supported the Wellbeing thread of the Aire Sund project. And this essentially involved supporting the community wellbeing group in the development of a wellbeing survey, piloting some evaluation techniques that could be utilised. So for example, helping with potentially using methodologies such as photo voice, or the use of poetry for evaluations of their walks that were conducted a couple of years ago now, actually, in fact. And again, just providing guidance on appropriate methodologies that could be used. This was all done or facilitated through a number of workshops with the community wellbeing group. And as Gordon mentioned in his summary as well of the work he was involved, he he had that dual role essentially as a researcher, but he also was a member of the community wellbeing group as well. So was able to give us those two perspectives on the work as well that we did, which was really fantastic. We also then helped the community group with analysis and then reporting of the final survey. Now, in year 2 or phase 2, I think we've taken more of a consultancy role, I'd say, or a back seat. The community group are now very much in the driving seat and using the knowledge that they've gained with their lived experience to then look at what's appropriate for evaluating the work that they've been doing. So I don't know if there was anything Heather wanted to add to that, or if we wanted to chat a little bit about what we think we've learned from the process, what was effective, or what recommendations or suggested protocols we had for going forward with co-production.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, sorry, I'm traveling at the moment, but I did manage to join this morning from the train. It did cut in and out, but I think one of the things that struck me was the conversation around funding. And one of the things I was reflecting on was I had never been to the islands before I came to North Uist at that time that Jess and I visited the first time together. And I know Jess from Aberdeen. We've worked together in Aberdeen. And I think the process of making that journey and meeting Jess there, who is now living just outside Stornoway, I think the conversations that we then started to have about, I don't know, the distance, the process of going through that journey, I think really hit upon me that you can't just kind of port yourself in as a researcher. And, you know, and I also think in terms of preparation of funding applications and the kind of rolling funding applications, funding would almost be necessary, because I almost wish if we were to do it differently that I had gone before and really understood the context, because in my Aberdeen office and in my COVID working on laptops, having conversations with people, planning some of the activities that we could have done, I think it was still very much in that not taking the island's context or not really understanding it. So to me, I think going somewhere first and having those conversations rather than sort of designing something in an online conversation, then going somewhere and it really hits you how, you know, as a designer, you know, the things that you're bringing to the table, I don't think I had the context, and that was the biggest learning for me. But I think in terms of what we did, I've done lots of co-production work before and working with community groups as researchers. And again, it's about funding the time to spend together and building relationships, and not just having that kind of one-off meeting or those couple of, and I'm not saying they were tokenistic in any way, because they really weren't, and that isn't what my intention to really use that word, but it could be seen as that, you know, on a grant funding application, or we'll have this many visits, or we'll come that many times, or we'll spend that many hours. And I know from previous in-depth ethnographic work that I did, it was for my PhD was 700 hours spending time with people. So it's like, you know, we need to look at that, I think, if we want to invest in and actually give a piece of work like this that time.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. And if it's okay, before, because I know we do have someone to come after us, so I'll be really quick. But I think that what you mentioned about having more time, and I think that's been some way, again, just congratulating Ideas Fund for kind of being responsive to that, allowing or being more responsive to changes in plans, essentially. And that's not always possible with funding, with the rigidness of their requirements. Because I think the big thing about co-production, and everyone realizes it when you start it, and this was my first experience, is that the forging of relationships is so important at the start, and it does take longer than you think it will take. And often funding, or the way it's set up, doesn't allow for that. And then it does become tokenistic almost.
I think as well the value of, you know, the investment that of the Ideas Fund money, and then that continuation of relationships. And I think, as was brought up this morning, around that kind of funding streams, and you not having that continuity, or maybe having gaps, or trying to scrabble about for different bits of money to fund different strands, for example, going forward. I think that's something that we need to consider.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Heather and Jess. That kind of helps really, again, sense of that idea around the co-production. And we always say, you know, you can only go at the pace of relationships. And I think that place-based element focus part of it seems really, really, I think really comes through so strongly, particularly, you know, we've done a lot of different projects, but particularly North Uist. I think that felt so important as well. I think we're going to introduce our next speaker. We are going to bring Ruthanne Baxter. So, of course, part of this project is really looking at the role of culture within communities in that sense of place. And Ruthanne Baxter, who I know from a few different hats, but speaking around social prescribing, maybe some kind of external perspectives on the project as well. So I'll hand over to you.
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. As Lewis said, I'm Ruthanne Baxter. I'm the Civic Engagement Manager for the University of Edinburgh Heritage Collections. And about 2018-19, with John's help, we set up an initiative called Prescribe Culture. So it's essentially, it was started off as being social prescribing programs for the student body at the University of Edinburgh, but then we had COVID and some of it went online, and then it was open to lots of people. So now it's sort of back in person, and it's open to both student and non-student patients in Edinburgh. But I did some research work with the University of Highlands and Eilean, and taking the prescribed culture approach and seeing if it could be transferable to a more rural area. So working with NHS Highlands and UHI, Sarah Ann Minogue and Sarah Bradley, we looked at doing the same sort of approach, but across various, we had 14 different museums, heritage centres across the Highlands involved. But as Lewis was saying, it's very, very place-based. So obviously the big differences are that you take a city like Edinburgh, which has got an embarrassment of riches, all quite close together geographically, and everyone is probably within a stone's throw of some heritage, whereas you put that up in the Highlands, and things like the community link workers, they have quite a distance to go often with an individual to bring them to a museum and bring them back, etc. So there was a lot of learning there about just the importance of really looking at social prescribing in its place, because that looks incredibly differently. Slightly connected to that, or as a sort of a result of that, I'm involved in an organisation called PERSE, which essentially stands for Personalised Care Interprofessional Education Group, and it is mostly university academics who teach on nursing and midwifery and a little bit of psychology in there, and they are looking at how to increase student placements for personalised care, including a little bit of social prescribing. So I've specifically sort of volunteered, if you like, to sort of be an ambassador for the rural aspect of that, because if you're a young student and you go on your student placement in a city, that looks very different if you're going to be on Uist for your placement and trying to involve some social prescribing. So one of the things I've been asked to think about for today was what maybe the next steps would be for a project like this. And what I would suggest is that, and I'm just going to be brutal here, I through my work with the university, I have worked in collaboration with an organisation, Headway East Lothian, and they came and got involved with prescribed culture, and through that, that relationship, because I totally echo what Jessica and Heather were saying, it's so much about the time that is put into developing trusted relationships that then you really need to like sort of build on that return on investment, if you like. So I would say to the community group, please just absolutely take the university relationships for the most you can get, because universities are huge organisations with massive resources, and the University of Edinburgh does have a community grant system. So I work with the Headway East Lothian group to sort of move them on a little from prescribed culture and to take it in their own way. So we worked together, and they got £5,000 from the uni to then take their members to other cultural and heritage organisations around East Lothian and Edinburgh City to sort of further what they did with us as a starting point. So they also got linked into the Centre for the Ageing Brain, etc. And there's lots of resources there. So just it's that thing about, for the community group, expanding on the relationships that you've spent time investing in. The other thing I would just throw out there, when I was thinking about this particular project, and I'm thinking about it in relation to another project I'm doing with a rural community which looks very different from your rural community, and it's actually in New Milnes, which is in a very, very deprived part of East Ayrshire, and they are definitely geographically closer to bigger places like Kilmarnock, etc., but they still feel extremely isolated, and there's about 3,000 of a population, and bit by bit everything in their town is closing down. But what we talked about was them having a citizen research coordinator. So there has been research done around New Milnes and the sort of the uniqueness of their story for quite a few years now, and now they're seeing an increase in asks, if you like, because they are quite a unique story. So they are sort of trying to make sure that their community does not get research fatigue. So they are starting to look at having a research strategy for themselves so that they don't exhaust everybody trying to look at everything, but also to, again, be about that, making the most of the relationships they've made already, etc. So I think that might be my 4 minutes up, and we stop talking. And if there's questions, please pop them in the chat line and John will field them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruthanne. It's really interesting to have an external perspective. I like the idea of what strikes me about this in the previous session is that coordination of the organisations involved in UHI's coordination of what's going on even within Tuath becomes important, and having someone with that responsibility, I think, is a direction that we should be looking at. So thank you. Back to you, Lewis.
Thanks, John. So I'm very wary of time, and so what I did want to do is bring in Màiri from CUT to join. But what I might suggest is, if there are any questions, please do put them in the chat, and we will field them as best we can. And maybe for the panelists, if you feel free to answer in the chat as well, or we can keep them afterwards. But what I would probably want to suggest, give time, is for Màiri, in terms of one of the key questions, what was learned, and what do you think are the kind of recommendations next. And what I might suggest is that just we won't have too much time for a longer discussion, but if it's okay with everyone, we might just do one quick go around for all the speakers, just to, share one kind of recommendation for what next, what you'd like to see next. So I'm giving you a little bit of time to think about that whilst Màiri's speaking, and then we'll close and transition to the Funders Forum, if that's okay. So so Màiri, I'm gonna bring you in. I can find you.
Thank you. I know I spoke a lot this morning, but that was because one of our group, unfortunately, had a serious bereavement. So we're thinking of you out there. I just wanted to send that message. So museums are undergoing a huge change at the moment. I think Black Lives Matter, COVID, have made us think more deeply about what our function is, how we include people who may seem different from ourselves, and what it is we're trying to do within our communities. What strands from the past are useful in terms of resilience and looking forward. And I think in the case of North Uist, and I have to say, there are quite a few English voices here, but I am of North Uist heritage. And it just indicates the migration that has had to occur amongst Uist families. But we all come back. It's our home here, and we all come back. Working with researchers in the first year was pretty marvelous for us. We learned a lot. The Wellbeing group, the initial Wellbeing group from the community was limited to 10, and we're all still very closely bound to each other. Janet Dix, who isn't represented today, has done an immense amount of artwork for us. So thank you, Janet. I want to be inclusive of everyone. I think if I use a metaphor, I would use the metaphor of researchers as gardeners with huge knowledge of plants, and us as tiny wee seeds that they put into pots and nourished with local soil local knowledge, local compost, everything recycled. And so that in the second year, our roots were strong enough and our trunks were strong enough and our connections with each other had been built strongly enough, with everyone sitting around this table as well, so that we were able to become novice, apprentice, co-researchers. Jess has mentioned the trust. I can't underestimate the fact of the sensitivity and understanding and respect that has existed amongst so many of us. I think that's paramount. That probably means that we feel we're not being done to, but we're working together alongside each other, even if they had a parental role to start with. The second thing I'd like to say is that the language is really important. You've heard over and over again how important Gaelic is here. Nuair bhag mi og vamo Farrington Aberdeen really me and to Gaelic. When I was young, my parents spoke in Gaelic, but my father felt at the age of 3, since he was working in England, I should learn English, a great regret of mine. But the language of research equally is a form of bilingualism and the local community. So we have written things at 2 levels. We've got some lovely research papers written by the academics, and we didn't want them to have to not reach their academic funding demands. But equally, we've done our research in a slightly more informal way. And when we said we wanted to start to drive it, I think what we've done is try ourselves to become novice researchers. Some of us already felt capable of looking at one of the strands from the survey. Loriana, sitting here, as an ornithologist, contributed beautifully to that. We were grateful for Stewart for coming in his busy schedule for that terrific evening you gave us, Stewart. And so, as I said in the film, we found we couldn't separate out the strands. They were like the fingers of one hand, but the language that we used was really important to that. And it probably works at 2 levels. Translation operates between Gaelic and English, but between academic language and the way that could be mediated to make sense to everyone on Uist. We are concerned to reframe the narratives of power, and that's been a pretty insistent theme throughout. And we feel the information structures need a huge rejigging. I think in my scrappy notes here, I would also like to say how well everyone's worked together collaboratively. Sometimes it's been very cumbersome, but informing everyone of every stage of everything is really important. That's something we've learned, turning ourselves into our own researchers, the channels of communication, and how we can become more sustainable on the island, not just to refurbish the school, which we think is really important. It could become such an important centre at the far end of the island here on the main road for all kinds of historical nourishment, sustainability, and everything else like that. But I think above and beyond, we actually need to thank our researchers for being our nurturers. And these seeds are now in a very important library. We have to thank Gordon for capturing the seeds they're all there in Guthan and CIALL, and I can't recommend it enough. He's worked with Community from 2012 at least, and that is like a seed library of things waiting to be developed.
Oh, dang. We got some claps there. Thank you so much. That's such a beautiful metaphor, Màiri, and so interesting to think about that kind of cross language. We're going to quick round robin, perhaps, to go back in the same order as we went before. A final reflection from the panelists, perhaps starting with yourself, Gordon.
Okay, well, very kind words, Màiri, and I can only say that the relationship has been mutually beneficial. You know, it's what we wanted to do, and it's so great that we've had a partner who's been willing to engage with us on that. If I've got a minute to talk about what we've learned and what's been effective, I think the big point which has come out of the survey was that Gaelic is, as an idea, is supported across the community, at least in principle. It's putting it into practice is the next question. So that's a question of what is effective. And I think what's come out of this is that it's really essential that there is action in support of social practice of the language, in addition to putting resources into teaching of the language. Competence in the language is not sufficient. There has to be an outlet for it actually to be practiced. Uist had a great metaphor at the beginning, talking about planting a tree, but then failing to, harvest the fruits. I sometimes talk about filling an empty bucket. That's great, but if the bucket's got holes in it, which is how people actually use language in daily life, then of course you can pour as much water into it as you like. It just all drains out away at the bottom. So there has to be a focus on how people actually use the language in daily life. And if you want to talk about policy frameworks that support that, they have to address that question. So that's my plug on that front. As far as recommendations or protocols for action would be concerned, it's all been said already. Someone's building trust and taking the time to listen is so important. This is addressed to universities, colleagues in universities, that you've got to take the time to listen to the language of the people of the community. And it's a listening exercise can be time consuming. And if you're not going to put the time in, don't start. Also, the title university carries with it its own gravitas. You need to be wary of that. Don't get sucked into the prestige which is attached to that title. You're there to offer support, not to direct it, I would say. And one last thing would be, if you're trying to assess the value of what you're doing and who's the beneficiary, by all means, include yourselves amongst the beneficiaries. But if the community that you're talking about is not the prime beneficiary of the place where you're doing the work, then you're not doing it right, and you need to start again and think again.
Thank Gordon. Some great reflections there. We'll come to Stewart.
Thank you. I would begin by quoting Private Jones in the context of climate change and saying, don't panic. Coasts change. That's what they do. It's the way they work. And you only need to be concerned when that change becomes something that is actually putting your assets or your community at risk. In that context, I would say that any adaptation you plan has to be very, very carefully planned so that it isn't maladaptation. And that is my greatest fear here. Gordon very sensibly warned against trusting universities too much. I would echo that and say, be very careful of people who seem to be offering a helping hand, because they're not always doing that. I'm obviously not talking about anybody in this meeting, but there has been a case in Uist of somebody parachuting in, offering all sorts of things, and really creating an almighty mess that the rest of us had to clear up. And it's not actually clear if they've gone away, but the personnel have entirely changed, so I do hope so. So the basic advice would be wary of maladaptation. Trust your own instincts, because they're probably good.
Thank you, Stuart. Again, lots of sage advice. We're going to go to Jessica and then to Heather.
I don't think I've really got much to add, really. I mean, I think for me, what was, I think, something that could only have happened, I think, personally, with having the co-production model in the research, and a legacy of that was that we were all together, we were able to identify the interconnectedness of all those areas we'd identified in the Wellbeing survey. So culture, heritage, the environment, spirituality and community, and how they were all intertwined. And you couldn't just look at one without thinking of the other aspects. And I really don't think we were able to find that without using the co-production, working with the community to do, to find that out. And I think, I suppose, agreeing with Gordon as well about the community first as the outcome, and what you get out of it needs to benefit the community first and foremost. But again, another sort of outcome, I would say, of this work as well has been that it is adding to that gap in the research as well on interconnectedness. And I'm just going to mention a paper that I just looked at this morning by Janet Heaton, who did a systematic review of experiences in mental wellbeing in the Scottish Islands. And she identified herself in her findings about people's connections to environment and community, how research to date has always looked at all these activities and aspects separately and not together. So I thought that was quite interesting, and again, a legacy of this work. I'm sorry, Heather, I don't know if I've given you enough time to chat.
I would say, I mean, there's so much emphasis in universities on using validated tools and in applied health research, and that was something that was a bit of a tension and as we sort of developed the survey. But I think to Stuart's point about maladapting, and the interconnectedness, I think it was really important for us to work with the community to develop a survey that was fit for purpose within that community.
And just to finish us off, Ruthanne, final.
So this is less a recommendation, more sort of an offer. So in my spare time, I run Gladden Village, which is an online social prescribing. I do it in my spare time as volunteer with a friend from Spain. But I'm just, whenever I was listening to James and Archie and Amanda, there's a couple of things. I have been asked, are any of the coffee house sessions in Gaelic? No, because there are no Gaelic speakers currently in the village. So if anyone, literally we have a system. So if anybody ever wanted to run some of the coffee house sessions in Gaelic, then we can absolutely make that happen. And the other thing is just to say that there is, with the resources that you guys have made there, I think there's so much more. There can be lots of sort of extended use. It's those sort of unexpected outcomes and outputs that can often appear when you start sort of getting near the end of a project like this. And there's an online thing called mini habitats. And I just think some of the videos that were shared, taking people across the island, etc., might be a wonderful thing to put up on that mini habitats. Tiny. It's called Tiny Habitats. And it's essentially online to help people who maybe at one point were ramblers and hikers and are physically no longer to be out there doing it. So they might be able to access that and at least recapture being out in the wilderness. So I can pop links to those into the chat line.
Okay. Thanks, Ruthanne. That'd be useful. Yeah, please do that. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're a little bit over. We did start a wee bit late, but I guess my final reflection is a massive thank you to the panelists for joining us and through this hard, cumbersome work. And I've seen that firsthand, and the patience and the partnership building that learning. So yeah, a massive thank you for us. We're going to transition to the Funders Forum, but I'll leave it to hand over to John to maybe round us off this session.
Thank you very much, Lewis. And I'd just like to echo Lewis's thanks to all the panel whose points of view have really enriched our day and given us a great deal of pause for thought. I like the idea of coordination, both for research within the community, avoiding the difficulties of maladaptation and making a bad situation worse, which we've all seen in different ways. One of the things I remember was when I was doing some reading over the last few years, and this is work by Daisy Fancourt in UCL, a big observational study, which showed that people who engage in almost any sort of cultural activity, whether it's going to music, art galleries, concerts, whatever, live longer than people who don't. And it was a very striking and rather unexpected finding. Perhaps it's not surprising, given what we now know about the nature of human beings, but it's something which perhaps doesn't get as much publicity as it deserves. So thank you all very much. If you want to stay on to the next session, we'd be delighted to see you. If not, thank you for your attendance. And I'll now pass on, I think, back to Màiri for the final session of the forum with funders. Màiri.
Right, I think Lewis is probably going to chair this session, but I'm sitting here in the wings. I was just going to pick up on one final point, which was the importance of video and oral recording. Way back when I was involved with other groups in the late 80s, we found that teachers would never fill in the assessment forms. But if we put them in a group and videoed them, they would give us wonderful feedback. And I think that's what today is really all about. Not only the importance of recording the oral work that we've done through Gordon, but also just talking about things, getting people together quickly to make a few points, achieves a huge amount. So we hope we can do this now with our funders. Over to you, Lewis.